So in this mini lecture, we'll begin interpreting the Euthyphro, and what we're going to do in this interpretation of it is focus on expert knowledge, in particular whether Euthyphro has expert knowledge, meaning the kind of knowledge that an expert would have. Euthyphro claims to be an expert in religious matters, but does he really have the kind of knowledge that such an expert would have to have? I mentioned before in the previous mini-lecture that Plato writes his dialogues such that different themes can be analyzed depending on what level one reads the dialogues. And so in the Euthyphro, I think, at one level, this is a dialogue about piety. I mean, that's what it straightforwardly seems to be about. The whole discussion that Euthyphro and Socrates has is about what piety is. But then, like you saw, at the end of the dialogue, they don't come to an answer. Right? There's no answer to what piety is. But still, that's definitely one thing, major thing that's going on in the dialogue. What piety is, what's the nature of the gods. At another level, it's about authority and whether or not things are right or wrong because an authority says so. So in the middle of the dialogue, where Socrates and Euthyphro were talking, and Socrates asked, is something pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's pious? The issue there is, why are things pious? Right? Why are things holy? And underneath this, right, why are things good or bad at all? Right? So is something good because, or something good or pious because the gods love it? Because the gods approve of it? Or do the gods approve of it because it's already pious or holy? Right? So that's the kind of authority issue at play in the Euthyphro. At another level, I think it's about knowledge. How do we know whether or not someone has expert knowledge? So we read the Euthyphro, and everyone who reads the Euthyphro pretty much comes away with the conclusion that Euthyphro does not have the kind of expert knowledge that he claims to have. Right? He's not actually an expert in religious matters, because he can't even explain to Socrates what this basic concept of piety is. And so the Euthyphro's about expert knowledge. And then I think at another level it's about the forms, I mean about what is the nature of reality, especially what is the nature of reality if rational inquiry is possible. So this week we're looking at the Euthyphro at this level of expert knowledge. And the reason why I want to start here is because I think this is the one thing everyone reading this dialogue can agree to. And by the time you get to the end, we don't have a good definition of piety, we don't know what that is. But we do know that Euthyphro doesn't actually know what he's talking about. He claims to be an expert in religious matters. He claims to be able to teach people about that, just like he claims at Socrates at the beginning that he can teach Socrates. But he can't even define the most basic religious concept of piety or holiness, which seems to suggest he's not actually an expert. He doesn't have expert knowledge in religious matters. So since that's the one thing we can all agree on, that's where I want to start in our interpretation of the Euthyphro. So here's an outline of all the different ways that Euthyphro attempts to define piety for Socrates. So Socrates says, tell me what piety is, tell me this one characteristic that all things that are pious share in common. In other words, define what piety is. Give me a real definition of piety. Like, explain what it is to me. And Euthyphro tries to do that, and he tries to do it, I've identified like 6 times throughout the dialogue where he does it. And so every time he gives a definition of piety, Socrates refutes it and says they can't be what piety really is, because the definition doesn't actually make sense or is formulated in the wrong way, right? There's different problems for each definition. But there they are, right? There's 6 of them altogether. What I want to do in this mini lecture here is go through the first 4, see what's wrong with them, and then see what we can take away from that in our understanding of why we don't think Euthyphro is an expert. That's really the interesting thing. We all read this, we all come away thinking Euthyphro is not an expert in religious matters. And so what I want to do is kind of go a little deeper. Well, why don't we think Euthyphro is an expert? What happens in this dialogue such that everyone who reads this recognizes that Euthyphro is not an expert in the religious matters that he claims to be an expert in. So nearly everyone who reads the Euthyphro agrees to at least one thing in the end, right? Euthyphro is not an expert in piety and religious matters. He doesn't have expert knowledge in what piety is. Why? Because he can't even explain what it is. He can't even give a definition that doesn't end up contradicting itself once Socrates asks a few questions. So by expert knowledge, what do I basically mean by that? I mean the kind of understanding that a scientist or another expert would have of his or her subject matter. Right? So if I'm talking to a physicist, right, the physicist has expert knowledge of physics. And so the physicist should be able to explain to me if I ask questions. They should have answers to what I say. Maybe some of their answers might be really complicated, but if we want to break it down slowly, they should be able to explain and teach me their knowledge. Likewise, an expert musicologist, right? Someone who knows musicology, right? They should be able to explain that, to teach it. An expert mathematician has this expert knowledge of mathematics. Right, so we're talking about this kind of knowledge that your professors have of their subject matters, right? Your math professor, your physics professor, your biology professor, whatever the case might be. So that kind of expert knowledge is what Euthyphro claims to have about religious matters. He claims to know what piety is better than everyone else, or at least better than most people, and he claims to be able to teach Socrates. And that's the kind of knowledge that we're talking about here. Now, how do we all know that Euthyphro is not an expert in piety? Right? I mean, that's what's interesting here, right? You read this, and we come away thinking, yeah, he's not an expert in piety, right? If we had to meet Euthyphro in person, I think we would kind of go, yeah, he doesn't really know quite what he's talking about when it comes to these religious matters. Sure, he might have a lot of interesting opinions, but he doesn't really have knowledge here. And so how do we know that? How do we come away from this dialogue knowing that Euthyphro doesn't have expert knowledge in piety? So here's a few ideas. He can't define his terms, right? All he's being asked to do is define what piety is, and he can't do that. Where if I ask a physicist, hey, define to me what an atom is, or what energy is, or the physicist can do that, right? Or ask a mathematician, define what an equation is. The expert mathematician can do that. But Euthyphro can't. He can't define these basic terms that he himself is using, claiming that what he's doing is pious, that he has special knowledge about piety. But he can't even define what piety is. Another reason why we would tend to think Euthyphro is not an expert in piety, his beliefs about piety end up contradicting themselves. Right? Socrates will ask him a few questions, and it turns out Euthyphro doesn't even have super worked out ideas. His ideas are in conflict with each other. That's another thing that an expert, a true expert, wouldn't have. Your math professor, right? They're not going to be, maybe they'll accidentally contradict themselves, but then they can correct it themselves, right? And in general, their knowledge is not contradictory. Their knowledge of mathematics, they have they know this mathematical system that makes sense, that all the parts fit together and don't contradict one another. The other thing is Euthyphro can't explain the reasons behind his beliefs, basically. So he has a lot of beliefs about things, but he ends up not being able to really give an explanation for those beliefs. And again, that's different from any expert. Right? Any expert in anything, if they have expert knowledge, they can explain why, in their subject matter at least, they hold the view that they do. So the expert, physicist or biologist, they can explain why, hey, here's why I have this belief about physics, or here's why a mathematician can say, here's why I think that this equation works. Or why I think that this number plus this number is that number. Where Euthyphro can't do that. If we look at the way the conversation in Euthyphro works, and why they, meaning Socrates and Euthyphro, are unable to come up with a satisfactory definition of piety, we can learn something about what we believe expert knowledge is, because we're the ones who read the dialogue and come away thinking that Euthyphro's not an expert. Right? So what we're actually doing here is trying to use this dialogue to figure out what we implicitly already think expert knowledge is. We already have some beliefs about what expert knowledge is. We want to get explicit about what those beliefs are. Right? We already have beliefs because when we read this dialogue, even before I mentioned it, you came away with it thinking that Euthyphro is not an expert in piety. And so why is that? Right? What do you actually think expert knowledge is? And so that's what we're going to do here in this mini lecture. So let's just go through at least the first 4 definitions Euthyphro gives, see what the problem with the definition is, and what we can learn about, because as he's failing to define his terms, that's how we're getting this idea that he's not an expert. So let's figure out what the problem is and then what we can take away from that. So the first definition Euthyphro tries to give is, he says, piety is what I'm doing right now, prosecuting a wrongdoer. So what's the problem with this definition? So the problem with this definition, as Socrates pointed out, is that it only covers some actions, prosecuting wrongdoers, that are pious, but not all. I mean, Euthyphro, and pretty much everyone else would admit, these prosecuting wrongdoers is not the only pious or holy thing. What about praying? What about offering sacrifices in the temple? Right? So there's plenty of things, there's plenty of people, there's plenty of actions that we would call pious or holy, or that in Greek culture they would call pious or holy, that have nothing to do with prosecuting wrongdoers. So even if it's true that prosecuting a wrongdoer is a pious or holy thing, by saying that, what is piety and prosecuting a wrongdoer, Euthyphro hasn't answered the question, because he's only given one example of piety. He hasn't actually explained what piety is. So from definition 1, I think we can learn that someone with expert knowledge can define what she knows, not just recognize examples. I think we all actually think this is true. I'm just trying to make it explicit. Right? So I can tell you that 1 + 1 is 2. I'm not a mathematician, but I can tell you that. That's 1 + 1 is 2, and I can also tell you that's an equation. But an expert mathematician could actually define what an equation is, right? They wouldn't just be able to say, hey, here's an example of an equation. They could tell you, here is the definition of an equation, right? Here's what an equation actually is. So most people can identify examples of things, right? I can identify examples of equations. I can identify examples of all kinds of things. But that doesn't mean I have expert knowledge of all kinds of things, because expert knowledge requires more than just identifying examples. It requires that I can actually tell you what kind of thing this is. And so I think, right, this is something that I think we all would agree to. I mean, I'm not sure. If you have objections against it, raise those in the Zoom session. But this is the basic idea I'm putting forward, is we all kind of recognize Euthyphro. This is not the right definition of piety that he's saying right here. And why? Because he's just giving you an example of piety. He's not telling you what all pious actions, people, places, things have in common. So he can't tell you what piety actually is. He's just giving you one example of a pious action. Second definition, the pious is what is dear to the gods, right? So Euthyphro kind of recognized, that didn't work, and so he says, okay, here's what I think can cover all cases of pious things, what's dear to the gods, right? And the idea here would be, a temple is a pious or holy place. Well, that's a place that's dear to the gods. This, different kinds of actions are holy or pious actions. Well, because those are the actions that are dear to the gods. The gods like those actions. Or maybe these people or this person is a holy or pious person. Well, that's because that person is dear to the gods. So Euthyphro's like, here, I've given you an example or a definition now that covers all the different examples. But Socrates also finds a problem with this definition. So what's the problem with this one? The problem with this definition ends up being that, given that Euthyphro himself thinks different things are dear to different gods, that this definition makes everything both pious and impious. So Euthyphro has this idea about the gods where the gods disagree with each other about what's pious or impious in certain cases, at least. right? So this comes from kind of Greek mythology. Gods like fight with each other and have, wars even in some cases. And so Euthyphro is buying into all those ideas. But the problem is, what that means is, say one person or one action, maybe some gods like that action and other ones don't. Right? So maybe if I pray to Zeus, another god like Kronos doesn't like that. But, Zeus does like it, right? So is it praying to Zeus pious or not? Because it's dear to one god, but it's not dear to this other god. And so that's a problem, because now you haven't told me, Euthyphro hasn't told us what all pious actions have in common, because now he's just made it so some actions are both pious and not pious. Right, so what do we learn from this? Expert knowledge is consistent with itself and doesn't contradict itself. The basic problem here is Euthyphro came up with this definition that the pious is what's dear to the gods, but didn't sort of realize that that's actually in contradiction and in conflict with his other view that the gods fight with one another and disagree with one another about these kind of things. So he doesn't actually have a very worked out, consistent system, and that's another reason why we see that he's not an expert and doesn't have expert knowledge, because experts, if they're really experts, they have a worked out system in the subject matter that they're experts at, right? A system that doesn't contradict itself. So Socrates points out this problem to Euthyphro. Euthyphro says, okay, wait a minute, let me just clarify this a little. What I meant by that was the pious is what all the gods love, right? So saying it's dear to the gods, maybe that's a little vague. If we just put in that word all there, it's what all the gods love, then we've got what I mean. But Socrates also points out there's a problem here. What's the problem with this definition? The problem with this definition is that it doesn't explain why piety is what it is, because it doesn't explain what it is about piety that makes the gods love it. So in other words, maybe it's true that everything that's pious and everyone that's pious and every action that's pious, the gods or all the gods love it. But that doesn't tell me what piety actually is. It just tells me, hey, the gods happen to like this. It doesn't tell me what is piety actually. It doesn't explain what is it about piety that makes, say, the gods love it. And again, Euthyphro ends up contradicting himself too by claiming that the pious is both God-loved. It just is the God-loved, but it also is what explains why the gods love it, right? So Socrates shows, and that's the kind of complicated argument where Socrates shows that piety would both have to have and not have this property of being God-loved in different respects. So from definition 3, I think we can learn that an expert understands and can explain the reasons why his claims are true. And that's what Euthyphro fails to do here. So this definition works in the sense that it covers all the cases. It doesn't obviously, it's not problematic in the way the other two were. But what Euthyphro can't do is explain the reasons why this claim is true. Like, why do all the gods love piety? What is it about piety? Like, what is piety actually such that all the gods are going to love it? And that's something that an expert, someone with expert knowledge can do. They could explain why they hold these claims that they hold, and why they hold the beliefs they do, and the claims that they do about their subject matter, at least. Right? So the mathematician can tell me, hey, here's why this claim about mathematics I'm saying is true. Where Euthyphro can't do that when it comes to piety. So if you can't give a full explanation of why what you're claiming is true, you're not an expert on that issue. I mean, I take it this is what we all think. This is why when we look at Euthyphro and we've read this dialogue, we're like, Euthyphro's not an expert. Maybe he's right even, but he's just not an expert. He doesn't have expert knowledge. And I take it the reason for that is because someone with expert knowledge can give a full explanation of why what they're claiming is true. They can kind of go back and back and back and give you kind of a bigger and bigger picture explanation of why the position that they're an expert on is true. Okay, the fourth definition that Euthyphro ends up giving, and this one Socrates helps him out a little bit with, is that piety is a kind or a part of justice, the part that concerns our being just towards the god or concerns our care of the gods. So Socrates helps him out with this one, where the idea here is that justice is kind of the wider category and piety is a part of it. So part of justice is like justice towards other humans, right? And that's what, if I'm unjust to you, then I've violated that kind of justice. But maybe there's this other kind of justice or other part of justice, right? This other class of justice that we would call piety, which is like being just towards the gods, or caring for the gods. And so they end up settling with this term, care for the gods. The problem with this definition ends up being that Euthyphro just can't explain what he means by care for the gods. Like, what do we mean by care for the gods, Socrates asks. Do the gods really need anything from us? I thought they're supposed to be all-powerful. And Euthyphro's like, yeah, I definitely think they're all-powerful. They don't really need our stuff. It's not like if I don't bring the temple or the sacrifice to the temple, if I don't offer some food to the statue there, like the god is going to starve. Well, no, because God is not like that at all. The gods they're super powerful beings. They have everything they could possibly need. They don't need stuff from us, actually. And so Socrates is like, well, then what do we mean by care? Like, when I care for horses, like I, make them better. When, I care for other things, I'm like helping out something. But am I helping out the gods? And yeah, again, Euthyphro is kind of like, well, yeah, I don't want to say you're helping out the gods because they don't really need your help. So what do we mean by care? And they kind of go around and around, and Euthyphro can never explain what he means by it. So I think from definition 4, what we learn is that an expert can explain how the properties of the things that she knows relate to other properties and characteristics. She can define all those characteristics consistently. And so the issue here is, how does piety relate to this larger category of justice? And what is it about piety that differentiates it from other kinds of justice, right? So we're talking about sort of how piety relates to these other concepts or ideas that are closely related to it. And the expert could definitely do that, right? It's like an expert mathematician can tell me, here's what the definition of an odd number is, here's how odd numbers relate to numbers in general, and the physicist can tell me, hey, here's what an atom is, here are the parts of an atom, here's how they relate to each other. And they kind of, again, the expert has this whole system worked out. It's a consistent system where these different properties, characteristics all relate to one another. And that's what expert knowledge is. It's having that, being able to understand that system and how it fits together. But Euthyphro doesn't have that. Right? He can't explain what he even means by care for the gods, which means he can't even explain how piety relates to justice, even though he thinks they're related. And that's another reason why, when we read this, we end up thinking Euthyphro is not an expert, because we think that experts can explain how the properties of the things that they know relate to other properties or characteristics that are relevant to the things that they know. So if we take all this together, so if we kind of just track down everything that we've seen here as we look through these 4 definitions, I think that we can say, hey, these are at least some of the characteristics of expert knowledge, the characteristics that we already think these are the characteristics of expert knowledge, and we just are trying to unpack them and get clear about them. So first of all, someone with expert knowledge can define what she knows. Not just recognize examples, but actually define what she knows. Say what this characteristic or property or whatever the thing that the expert knows, she can define the terms that she's using for you. Expert knowledge is consistent with itself. It doesn't contradict itself. Right? That's another characteristic. Anyone who actually has expert knowledge, when that knowledge won't contradict itself. And insofar as they're experts, they won't contradict themselves. An expert understands and can explain the reasons why his claims are true. And then finally, an expert can explain how the properties of the things she knows relate to other properties and characteristics, and she can define all those characteristics consistently. Right? We end up with a coherent system that doesn't contradict itself, and the expert can explain why everything has its place in that system that it has, and again, can do it in a consistent way that doesn't contradict itself, and can define all the terms as well. And so I think this again is not, none of this is obviously spelled out in the dialogue, but that's what I said when I said Plato wrote these dialogues to force us to do philosophy, right? Because when we come to this dialogue and we go, well, what can we agree about as we get to the end of this dialogue? And it's like, well, wait, we all agree that Euthyphro is not an expert, whatever else is going on here. And then when we go back and start reflecting on why do we think that, what about each of these definitions kind of goes wrong, we can do philosophy, right? And we can sort of come up with, hey, here's what we think expert knowledge actually is. So that's what I've come up with, at least. These characteristics, I think, are characteristics of expert knowledge. These are the kind of characteristics that I would expect an expert in mathematics or in physics or in biology or in any other discipline to be able to show. And the question is, I guess, do you think this is right? Right? Is this kind of unpacking what you were thinking too? Or do you have questions about this? Do you have objections to this?